The Jesus Disciples Seminary textbooks can be ordered from Amazon. Do a search for Jesus Disciples Seminary.
Lesson 13. Attributes of Love. Review. Moral agents possess intellect, or the ability and capacity of knowledge. They also possess emotions and sensitivity, or in other words, the capacity of feeling. They also possess will or the power of choosing or refusing in every case of moral obligation. These abilities and capacities are so related to each other that the intellect or the emotions may control the will, or the will may, in a certain sense, control them. That is, the will is free to choose in accordance with the demands of the intellect, which is the law-giving faculty, or with the desires and impulses of the emotions, or it can control and direct them both. The will can either command or obey. It can allow itself to be enslaved by the impulses of the emotions, or it can put forth its power and control them. The will is not influenced by either the intellect or the emotions, by the law of necessity or force, so that the will can always resist either the demands of the intelligence or the impulses of the emotions. But while they cannot lord it over the will, through the agency of any law of force, the will has the aid of the law of necessity or force by which to control them. Again, we are constantly reminding ourselves of our obligation to obey the law of the intellect rather than the impulses of the emotions, that to act with virtue, we must act rationally, or intelligently, and not give ourselves up to the blind impulses of our feelings. Now, 1. The love required by the moral law consists in choice, or willing, as before repeatedly shown. 2. Choice or willing controls the states of the intellect and the outward actions directly, by a law of necessity. 3. The same law controls the feelings or states of the sensibility indirectly. For certain states of the intellect and of the sensibility, and also certain outward actions, must be implied in the existence of the love which the law of God requires. 5. The thoughts, opinions, judgments, feelings, and outward actions must be molded and modified by the state of the heart or will. All of the moral attributes of God and of all holy beings are only attributes of love. Love, it is important to remark, is a term that expresses them all. God is love. This term expresses God's whole moral character. Love is good-willing, or the choice of the highest good of God and the universe as an end. Love, let it be remembered, is the obedience of the will to the law of reason and of God. It is willing good as an end, for its own sake, and not to gratify self. Selfishness consists in the obedience of the will to the impulses of the emotions. It is a spirit of self-gratification. Let us now proceed to point out the attributes of that love which constitutes obedience to the law of God. Voluntariness, liberty, freedom, and intelligence are natural attributes of this love. 1. Voluntary. That is to say, it is a choice of the will. The term is often used to express the emotion of fondness or attachment as distinct from a voluntary state of mind, or a choice of the will. This emotion or feeling, as we are all aware, is purely an involuntary state of mind. Because it has to do with the emotions and of course a passive state of mind, it has in itself no moral character. The law of God requires voluntary love or goodwill as has been repeatedly shown. This love consists in choice. If it consists in the choice of the will, it must control the thoughts and states of the emotions as well as the outward action. It also implies that everything in the course of life that flows from the will be consecrated to this end. 2. Freedom is an attribute of this love. The mind is free and spontaneous in its exercise. It makes this choice when it has the power at every moment to choose self-gratification as an end. 3. Intelligence. That is, the mind makes choice of this end intelligently. It not only knows what it chooses, and why it chooses, but also that it chooses in accordance with the dictates of the intellect, and the law of God. The following are moral attributes. 4. Virtue. Virtue is a term that expresses the moral character of love. It is moral rightness. Moral rightness is moral perfection, righteousness, or uprightness. In other words, it is conscious of being virtuous or holy, of being like God, of loving what ought to be loved, and of consecration to the right end. Because the conscience approves of this choice, therefore, there is and must be in the emotions a feeling of happiness or satisfaction, a feeling of delight in the love that is in the heart or will. These feelings are often very joyous, insomuch that the soul, in the exercise of this love of the heart, is sometimes led to rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. Much depends in this respect on the clearness of the intellectual views, upon the state of the emotions, and upon the manifestation of the Holy Spirit to the soul. Conscious peace of mind, and conscious joy in God, must be where true love to God exists. 5. Disinterestedness is another attribute of this love. This term expresses the mind's choice of an end for its own sake, and not merely upon condition that the good belongs to self. It is this attribute particularly that distinguishes this love from selfish love. Selfish love makes the relation of God to self the condition to choosing it. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 5. Charity, love, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. There is a divine economy in love. Each loving soul not only enjoys his own good things, but also enjoys the good things of all others so far as he know their happiness. He not only rejoices in doing good to others, but also in beholding their enjoyment of good things. He is happy in beholding the pleasure of the beasts of the field, the fowls of the air, the fishes of the sea. He sympathizes with all joy and all suffering known to him. 6. Impartial. Other things being equal, it matters not to whom the good belongs. It is no respecter of persons. But love knows neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, white nor black, barbarian, European, Asiatic, African, nor American, but accounts all men as men, and by virtue of their common manhood, calls every man a brother, and seeks the interests of all and of each. This love can have no fellowship with those ridiculous prejudices that are so often common among nominal Christians. 7. Universal. Love chooses the highest good of being in general. It excludes none from its regard, but on the contrary it embraces all. But by this it is not intended, that it practically seeks to promote the good of every individual. It would if it could, but it seeks the highest practicable amount of good. It is the state of mind required by Christ in the truly divine precept. Matthew 5 verse 44. I say unto you, love your enemies, pray for them that hate you, and do good unto them that despitefully use and persecute you. 8. Efficient. Now we know from consciousness that choice constitutes the mind's deepest source or power of action. If I honestly choose a thing, I cannot but make efforts to accomplish that which I choose provided that I believe the thing possible. If I choose an end, this choice must and will energize to secure its end. Efficiency, therefore, is an attribute of love's choice. It must, it will, it does energize in God, in angels, in saints on earth, and in heaven. It was this attribute to love that led God to give His only begotten Son, and that led the Son to give Himself. John 3 verse 15. That whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. If love is efficient in producing outward action, and efficient in producing inward feelings, it is efficient to wake up the intellect, and set the world of thought in action to devise ways and means for realizing its end. While effort is possible to a Christian, it is as natural to him as his breath. He has within him the very mainspring of activity, a heart set on the promotion of the highest good of universal being. While he has life and activity at all, it will, and it must, be directed to this end. Let this never be forgotten. An idle, and inactive, inefficient Christian is a misnomer. Religion is an essentially active principle, and when and while it exists, it must exercise and manifest itself. It is not merely good without making efforts to realize their desires. They may desire without action. If their will is active, their life must be. 9. Complacent. This consists in love and viewing its relations to holy beings. This term also expresses both a state of the intelligence and of the emotions. Moral agents are so constituted that they necessarily approve of moral excellence, and when even sinners behold right character or moral goodness, they are compelled to respect and approve it by a law of their intelligence. This they not infrequently regard as evidence of goodness in themselves. But this is doubtless just as common in hell as it is on earth. The worst sinners on earth or in hell have, by the constitution of their nature, the necessity imposed upon them of paying intellectual respect to moral excellence. It is remarkable to what extent religion is regarded as a part of the emotions, and is consisting in mere feelings. So common is it, indeed, that almost uniformly, when professed Christians speak of their religion, they speak of their feelings, or the state of their emotions, instead of speaking of their conscious consecration to God and the good of being. Nothing is of greater importance than forever to understand that religion is always and necessarily produces outward action and inward feelings, that, on account of the connection of the intellect and emotions, almost any and every variety of feeling may exist in the mind, as produced by the perceptions of the intellect, whatever the state of the will may be, that unless we are conscious of goodwill, or of consecration to God and the good of being, unless we are conscious of living for this end, it avails us nothing, whatever our views and feelings may be. And also it behooves us to consider that, although these views and feelings may exist while the heart is wrong, they will certainly exist when the heart is right, that there may be feeling, and deep feeling, when the heart is in a selfish attitude, yet, that there will and must be deep emotion and strenuous action, when the heart is right. 10. Opposition to sin is another attribute or characteristic of true love to God. Love is good-willing, or willing the highest good of being as an end. Now there is nothing in the universe more destructive of this good than sin. Love cannot do otherwise than be forever opposed to sin, as that abominable thing which it necessarily hates. It is absurd and a contradiction to affirm that love is not opposed to sin. God is love. He must, therefore, be the opponent of sin in every form and degree. Opposition to all sin is, and must be, a choice of the will, and on that ground alone it becomes virtue. When the intellect strongly disapproves of, and denounces sin, there is naturally and necessarily a corresponding feeling of opposition to it in the sense and emotion of loathing, of hatred, of abhorrence. This is often mistaken for opposition of the will, or heart. This is manifest from the fact that often the most notorious sinners manifest strong indignation in view of oppression, injustice, falsehood, and many other forms of sin. This condition of the emotions and of the intellect, as I said, is often mistaken for a virtuous opposition to sin, which it cannot be unless it involves an act of the will. But let it be remembered that virtuous opposition to sin is a characteristic of love to God and man. This opposition to sin cannot possibly coexist with any degree of sin in the heart. That is, this opposition cannot coexist with a sinful choice. The will cannot at the same time be opposed to sin and commit sin. Opposition to sin as a condition of the intellect or of the emotions may exist. In other words, the intellect may strongly disapprove of sin, and the emotions may feel strongly opposed to certain forms of it, while at the same time, the will may cling to self-indulgence in other forms. This fact, no doubt, accounts for the common mistake that we can, at the same time, exercise a virtuous opposition to sin, and still continue to commit it. Many are, no doubt, laboring under this fatal delusion. They are conscious, not only of an intellectual disapproval of sin in certain forms, but also, at times, of strong feelings of opposition to it. And yet they are also conscious of continuing to commit it. They, therefore, conclude that they have a principle of holiness in them, and also a principle of sin, that they are partly holy and partly sinful at the same time. Their opposition of intellect and of feeling, they suppose to be a holy opposition, when, no doubt, it is just as common in hell, and even more so than it is on earth, for the reason that sin is more naked there than it generally is here. I am a moral agent. My intellect necessarily disapproves of sin. My emotion is so connected to my intellect that it sympathizes with it, or is affected by its perceptions and its judgments. I contemplate sin. I necessarily disapprove of it, and condemn it. This affects my emotions. I loathe and abhor it. I nevertheless commit it. Now how is this to be accounted for? The usual method is by ascribing it to a depravity in the will itself, a lapsed or corrupted state of the faculty, so that it chooses sin for its own sake. They say this will continue until that faculty, will, is renewed by the Holy Spirit, and a holy influence is impressed upon the will itself. But here is a gross mistake. In order to see the truth upon this subject, it is of great importance to inquire what sin is. It is admitted on all hands that selfishness is sin. Comparatively few seem to understand that selfishness is the whole of sin, and that every form of sin may be resolved into selfishness, just as every form of virtue may be resolved into love. Selfishness is sin. But what is selfishness? It is the choice of self-gratification as an end. It is the preference of our own gratification to the highest good of universal being. Self-gratification is the supreme end of selfishness. This choice is sinful. That is, the moral of this selfish choice is sin. Now, in no case, is or can sin be chosen for its own sake, or as an end. Wherever anything is chosen to gratify self, it is not chosen because the choice is sinful, but notwithstanding it is sinful. Stealing is sinful. But no thief steals to be sinful. Drunkenness is sinful. But no person drinks to be sinful. We choose the self-gratification, but no sin, as an end. Eve ate the forbidden fruit. This eating was sinful. But the thing that she chose or intended was not the sinfulness of eating, but the gratification expected from the fruit. To say that sin is, or can be, chosen for its own sake, is untrue and absurd. Sin may be sought and loved as a means, but never as an end. It is, after all, self-gratification that is chosen as an end, and not sin. Sin is the means, and self-gratification is the end. Example: a drunk is thinking about the moral character of drunkenness. He instantly and necessarily condemns the abomination. His emotion sympathizes with the intellect. He hates the sinfulness of drinking strong drink and himself on account of it. He is ashamed, and were it possible, he would spit in his own face. Now, in this state, it would surely be absurd to suppose that he could choose sin, the sin of drinking, as an end, or for its own sake. This would be choosing it for an impossible reason, and not for no reason. For while the intellect condemns the sin of drinking strong drink, and the emotions hate the sinfulness of the indulgence, nevertheless there still exists so strong an appetite, not for the sin, but for the liquor, that the will seeks the gratification, notwithstanding the sinfulness of it. The emotions hate the sinfulness, but more strongly desires the thing the choice of which is sinful. The will in a selfish being yields to the strongest impulse of the emotions, and the end chosen is, in no case, the sinfulness of the act, but self-gratification. Those who suppose this opposition of the intellect, or of the emotion, to be a holy principle, are fatally deluded. It is this kind of opposition to sin that often manifests itself among wicked men, and that leads them to take credit for goodness or virtue, not an atom of which do they possess. Let it be ever remembered, then, that a virtuous opposition to sin is always and necessarily an attribute of love, a condition of the will, and that it is naturally impossible that this opposition of will should coexist with the commission of sin. 11. Compassion for the miserable. There is a compassion also which is a condition of the emotions. It may, and does often, exist in the form of an emotion. But this emotion, being involuntary, has no moral character in itself. The compassion which is a virtue, and which is required of us as a duty, is a condition of the will, and is of course an attribute of love. Love wills that happiness should exist for its own sake. It must, therefore, wish that misery might not exist. Compassion of will is a willing particularly that the miserable should be happy. Compassion of emotions is simply a feeling of pity in view of misery. As has been said, it is not a virtue. It is only a desire, but not willing, consequently does not benefit its object. This kind of compassion may evidently coexist with selfishness. But compassion of heart or will cannot, for it consists in willing the happiness of the miserable of its own sake, and of course is impartial. It will, and from its very nature must, deny self to promote its end. Circumstances may exist that render it unwise to express this compassion by actually extending relief to the lost in hell. Many circumstances may exist in which, although compassion would hasten to the relief of its object, yet on the whole, the misery that exists is regarded as the less of two evils, and therefore, the wisdom of love forbids it to put forth action to save its object. It should be said, before I leave the consideration of this attribute, that the will is often influenced by the feeling of compassion. In this case, the mind is no less selfish in seeking to promote the relief and happiness of its object than it is in any other form of selfishness. The happiness of the miserable is not in this case sought as an end, or for its own sake, but as a means of gratifying our own feelings. This is not obedience of will to the law of the intellect, but obedience to the impulse of the emotions. It is not a natural and intelligent compassion, but just such compassion as we often see mere animals exercise. They will risk, and even lay down, their lives to give relief to one of their number, or to a man who is in misery. In them this has no moral character. Having no reason, it is not sin for them to obey their emotions, nay, this is a law of their being. This they cannot but do. For them, then, to seek their own gratification as an end is not sin. But man has reason, he is bound to obey it. When he seeks it for no higher reason than to gratify his feelings, he denies his humanity. He seeks it, not out of regard to the sufferer, but in self-defense, or to relieve his own pain, and to gratify his own desires. This in him is sin. Men are always taking credit for holiness, when their holiness is only sin. But I must not leave this subject without observing, that when compassion exists as a condition of the will, it will certainly also exist as a feeling of the emotions. A man of a compassionate heart will also be a man of compassionate emotions. He will feel and he will act. Nevertheless, his actions will not be the effect of his feelings, but will be the result of his sober judgment. 3 classes of persons thought to be compassionate. A feels compassion, this does not influence the will, he does nothing about it. B feels compassion, he will do something, but not an act of will or heart. C. He feels compassion, obeys his reason to serve God and highest good of universe acts. 12. Mercy. This term expresses a state of feeling, and represents a condition of the emotions. Mercy is often understood to be the same as compassion, but then it is not rightly understood. Mercy, considered as a condition of the will, is an attitude to pardon crime. Such is the nature of love, that it will seek the good even of those who deserve evil, when this can be wisely done. It is ready to forgive, to seek the good of the evil and unthankful, and to pardon when there is repentance. Psalms 86 verse 5. For thou, Lord, art good, and ready to forgive, and plenteous in mercy unto all them that call upon thee. It is goodwill viewed in relation to one who deserves punishment. Mercy, considered as a feeling or emotion, is a desire for the pardon or good of one who deserves punishment. It is only a feeling, a desire. Of course it is involuntary, and has, in itself, no moral character. Mercy will, of course, manifest itself in action and in effort to pardon, or to procure a pardon, unless the attribute of wisdom prevents. It may be unwise to pardon, or to seek the pardon of a guilty one. It was this attribute of love, modified and limited in its exercise by wisdom and justice, that energized in providing the means, and in opening the way, for the pardon of our guilty race. As wisdom and justice are also attributes of love, mercy can never manifest itself by efforts to secure its end, except in a manner and upon conditions that do not set aside justice and wisdom. No one attribute of love is or can be exercised at the expense of another, or in opposition to it. And we must infer, too, from the term itself, that the means are acceptable, because it is absurd to suppose that good would be chosen because it is good, and yet that the mind that makes this choice should not hesitate to use injurious means to obtain its end. The mind that can fix upon the highest well-being of God and universe as an end, can never consent to use efforts for the accomplishment of this end that are seen to be inconsistent with it, that is, that tend to prevent the highest good of being. Mercy as a mere feeling would pardon without repentance or condition, would pardon without reference to public justice. But viewed in connection with the other attributes of benevolence, we learn that, although a real attribute of love, yet it is not and cannot be exercised, without the fulfillment of those conditions that will secure the consent of all the other attributes of benevolence. This truth is beautifully taught and illustrated in the doctrine and fact of atonement.
All of the Jesus Disciples Seminary textbooks can be ordered from Amazon. Do a search for Jesus Disciples Seminary.